Talking to Ghaffur was literally like talking to an encyclopedia. He had an amazing head for detail, an amazing memory for dates, a quite astonishing ability to remember the nuances of what he was saying and what other people were claiming. Friends, one of the advantages of being the last of a long chain of speakers is that they have already told you, my predecessors, the major features of Mr. A. Ghaffur Noorani's life and work. And so I can confine my remarks to my personal interaction with him. Unlike all of them who met Ghaffur themselves as friends, as colleagues, I was introduced to him by his brother who had emigrated to Pakistan and was in Karachi. And it was from Karachi that he let Noorani know that I existed. And that is how, when I returned from Karachi and was made the spokesman of the Ministry of External Affairs, opportunity arose to meet with him. Talking to Ghaffur was literally like talking to an encyclopedia. He had an amazing head for detail, an amazing memory for dates, a quite astonishing ability to remember the nuances of what he was saying and what other people were claiming. And therefore one approached him not only with humility, but also with a certain inferiority complex. Because there was simply no way in which one could match the depth or width of his knowledge. And he deployed that not in order to show off, but in order to work out the argument, to fill it out. And it is there that I found he had an ability to understand issues that are very rare to come across in anyone else. Thus, for example, on Kashmir, there was nothing significant about Kashmir or its political personalities or the relevant parts of its history that he was not acquainted with, where he did not understand the connection between personalities and the policies that evolved, that no event was haphazard, that it was all connected with the persona involved, and that their policies, given who they were, could not be different to what in fact they had been. So this gave him an understanding that many of us would have extreme difficulty in either imitating ourselves or in combating. And the same, I think, is true of his understanding of the India-China border issue. I think if we had actually just handed over to him the responsibility of talking to the Chinese, we might have arrived at a solution not years but decades ago. For he really understood every nook and cranny of that extremely difficult border. He understood what most of us are only very dimly aware of. And above all, he brought no jingoism to bear upon his argument. Unfortunately, far too many Indians are so convinced of their point of view that they don't have the time to understand the nuances of the subject, to understand how the Chinese might look at it, and therefore we tend to talk past each other instead of talking to each other. Equally, on Pakistan, he had a profundity of thought and knowledge that continually astonished me. I found that he had deliberately decided not to go to Pakistan, which is why part of his family was there. I mean, the first Noorani I met was not Gafur, but his brother. And he decided that it would not be in keeping with his convictions that he go across for reasons of religion to Pakistan. And so, like several of our Muslim friends here today in this hall, including, I think, Qurban Sahib, he made a conscious decision to remain in India. But the confidence with which he made that decision made it possible for him to not overdo it, to not think in terms of what was wrong with Pakistan so much as to see why it was that they were taking the attitudes that they were taking. And this very meandering course that India-Pakistan relations has taken over decades, he somehow seemed to know every turn in that meandering course. He was very particular in ensuring that the letter of the agreement had to be understood first before you could understand the spirit of it. And so he would insist that one get the letter right. What had been agreed, what was written down, not what we thought was written down, but what was actually written down. And what then were the implications of what had been written down. To the extent that it was possible for him as an outsider to know about the background to a particular formulation, he would use that information saying that originally the formulation was going to run thus. If eventually it was in this manner that it came to be, then we needed to understand what were the compulsions on either side, the Indian side or the Pakistani side, that made a possible formulation of that point different to the one that was actually made. And this gave a certain subtlety to his thinking that one doesn't come across often enough. At the same time, he was a very gentle man. It was a pleasure being with him because his interests were not confined to what he wrote. He also had a sense of humor. And that too, when he dropped being an encyclopedia and became almost human, at that point you could see that his knowledge of poetry, for example, his knowledge of how to be a good human being, it came through so very clearly. The one thing about him that I was never able to fully comprehend was his being such a natty dresser. So even on the hottest day, he would be wearing a three-piece suit. It would not be made of polyester, it would be made of wool. And as one watched him, he was not sweating, I was sweating. And I was wondering how this human being could live inside the thermal wear that he had on and still survive. But somehow the outside temperature did not seem to touch him because the inner repose was there to keep him cool even when the weather was being unkind. I was very, very sad to hear of his passing away. I was aware, of course, that he was well into his 90s and that where, in fact, today it's become fairly normal for one to cross one's 80s. In fact, I see that a majority of those on this panel have crossed 80 and can confidently look to being 90. Nevertheless, when people like him or my friend Natwar Singh suddenly pass away, it comes as a blow because it reinforces one's own mortality. So I pay my compliments to A.G. Noorani. I think we should follow his example to the extent we can. It will be very difficult to become a clone of his because he had so much learning and he carried it all in his head and he knew exactly where to look for what. That we can't, all of us, expect to be a walking Noorani. But he did show that it was important to get one's facts right. It was important to get one's dates right. And if you don't get these elementary parameters correctly, then the conclusions that follow are bound to be wrong. So he wasn't fastidious. He wasn't pernickety. He was merely setting the parameters for arguments that would beautifully follow in a completely logical way thereafter and be enlightened with oratorical flourishes that remain in one's mind. Fortunately, I never had to go to him as a lawyer. In fact, I have no desire to be a client of Salman Khurshid or anybody else. It's good to be out of the hands of the law. But I know people who did turn to him, and he brought his immense legal acumen onto that task. I was not sufficiently familiar with it to be able to talk to you about it. But others like Colin and others who've spoken have explained to you why he was as celebrated a legal luminary as he was. So, paying my tribute to a 95-year-old veteran, I take my leave of you. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.